The decision was made quietly, without ceremony, without warning. No press conference, no announcement. Just a single document placed before the king, and a pen that hesitated longer than anyone expected. What had been discovered behind palace walls was serious enough to force immediate action, yet sensitive enough to be kept from public view. Those closest to the situation knew instantly that this was no routine matter. The atmosphere shifted the moment the discovery was confirmed. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Advisors exchanged looks that said more than words ever could. And at the center of it all, King Charles remained unusually silent. This was not about politics. It was not about tradition alone. It was about stability, and the realization that something long assumed to be secure suddenly wasn't. Within hours, an emergency order was prepared. Not debated publicly, not delayed. Signed with urgency that stunned even seasoned insiders. What made this moment truly unsettling was not the order itself, but the reason behind it, a discovery so unexpected that it forced the king to act faster than anyone had seen before. No one outside the palace knew yet. But inside, one truth was already clear. This decision would quietly reshape the course of events moving forward. And once the order was signed, there was no turning back. The palace had seen countless moments of tension before, but this one felt different. There was no chaos, no raised voices, no visible panic. Instead, there was an unmistakable heaviness, the kind that settles when something fundamental has been called into question. King Charles was informed earlier than usual, and the way the information was delivered made it immediately clear that this was not routine. The discovery had not been anticipated. It had not been planned for, and yet it demanded immediate attention. Those present noticed the shift instantly. The king listened carefully, without interruption, his expression controlled but thoughtful. He did not react impulsively. He did not speak right away. Instead, he absorbed every detail in silence. This was not a moment for emotion. It was a moment for judgment. The discovery itself was not dramatic in the way rumors often suggest. There were no confrontations, no sudden revelations made in anger. What made it alarming was its implication, the realization that something previously overlooked now required decisive action. King Charles had always been known for his measured approach. He valued deliberation, tradition, and continuity. Emergency decisions were not taken lightly. Yet, as the information settled, it became clear that waiting was no longer an option. The issue touched directly on stability, on order, on the delicate balance that held everything together behind the scenes. And once that balance appeared uncertain, responsibility demanded response. Advisors were consulted quietly. Documents reviewed. Every possible implication considered. Time, however, was not a luxury they had. The atmosphere in the room remained controlled, but the urgency was undeniable. This was not about public perception. It was about safeguarding something far larger than headlines. King Charles finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. There was no hesitation in his words. Whatever had been discovered had crossed a line where inaction was no longer acceptable. The order was drafted with precision, each line carefully chosen. Nothing excessive, nothing symbolic, purely practical, designed to address the situation swiftly and discreetly. When the document was placed before him, the room fell completely silent. This was not a ceremonial act. It was a necessary one. The king paused briefly, not out of doubt, but out of understanding. He knew the weight of what he was about to authorize. He also knew the consequences of doing nothing. With a steady hand, he signed. In that quiet moment, a significant shift occurred, not one the public could see, but one that would be felt in the decisions that followed. The order did not solve everything. It was not meant to. It was meant to stabilize, to contain, to ensure that the situation did not escalate further. Once signed, the document was immediately secured. Instructions were given. Steps were put into motion. Outside those walls, the day continued as normal. No sirens, no statements. No indication that anything had changed. But inside the palace, everyone understood one thing clearly. The discovery had altered the course of events. And from that moment forward, Nothing would be handled casually again. The moment the order was signed, no one spoke. Not because they were unsure of what had happened, but because everyone in the room understood the weight of it. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a line drawn quietly, firmly, and without public awareness. King Charles remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze resting on the document as though ensuring every word had settled into place. He had signed many papers in his lifetime, each carrying its own responsibility. But this one felt different. It carried urgency without drama, authority without spectacle. Those present waited, aware that whatever came next would define how the discovery would be handled. There was no room for assumption or interpretation. Everything would proceed with care. The king finally rose, his movements calm, controlled. He gave a brief instruction, nothing loud, nothing rushed, yet it was clear that the order was already in motion. Each person in the room understood their role without further explanation. The discovery itself was still being processed behind the scenes. It had not been shared widely, and that was intentional. Not because it was being hidden out of fear, but because it required precision, not speculation. The wrong interpretation could destabilize more than it resolved. King Charles understood this better than anyone. Stability was never maintained through reaction. It was maintained through restraint. As he walked through the corridor, the familiar surroundings felt subtly altered. The palace had not changed, yet the atmosphere had. It carried a quiet alertness, a sense that something important was unfolding beneath the surface. Staff continued their duties as usual. Doors opened and closed. Conversations carried on in low tones. To an outsider, nothing appeared unusual. And that was exactly the point. Behind the scenes, however, careful steps were being taken. Communications were monitored. Schedules adjusted slightly. Not enough to draw attention, just enough to ensure control. The king retreated briefly to a private space, allowing himself a moment of reflection. Not doubt, reflection. He understood the consequences of action just as clearly as the consequences of inaction. This decision had been made because waiting would have risked greater uncertainty. His thoughts returned to the discovery itself, not the details, but the implication. It had challenged an assumption long taken for granted. And when assumptions fail, leadership is tested. There was no anger in his expression. No visible frustration. Only resolve. He had learned long ago that leadership was not about reaction, but about responsibility. And responsibility sometimes demanded decisions that would never be acknowledged publicly, yet would shape outcomes quietly. As hours passed, reports began to return. Everything was proceeding as instructed. The order had done what it was intended to do: stabilize, contain, prevent escalation. Still, the king knew this was not the end. It was a measure taken to create space to understand fully, space to plan carefully, space to protect what mattered most. The discovery had not threatened tradition. It had tested preparedness. That distinction mattered. As evening approached, the palace lights softened, casting long shadows across the corridors. The day had unfolded without public disruption, yet within those walls, a shift had occurred. King Charles stood near a window, looking out across the grounds. From a distance, everything appeared unchanged. Calm, orderly, predictable. But he knew better. The true work had only just begun, not in haste. Not in secrecy, but in deliberate steps guided by responsibility. The emergency order had not been signed out of fear. It had been signed out of foresight. And in the silence that followed, one truth remained clear. Whatever had been discovered would not be ignored, but neither would it be allowed to define events recklessly. Control had been asserted. Stability had been protected. And the consequences of this decision would unfold quietly. One careful step at a time. As night settled over the palace, the absence of sound felt deliberate. This was not the quiet of exhaustion, but the quiet of control. Every step taken earlier in the day had been measured, every word chosen carefully. And yet, what remained unspoken carried more weight than anything that had been said aloud. The discovery had been contained, but not forgotten. Behind closed doors, it continued to shape conversations, not through panic but through caution. The emergency order had stabilized the immediate situation, but its true purpose was now unfolding. To buy time to assess. Time to understand. Time to ensure that whatever followed would be guided by clarity rather than reaction. King Charles remained calm throughout the evening, though those closest to him noticed the depth of his focus. This was not distraction. It was concentration, the kind that comes when responsibility stretches beyond routine and into consequence. He understood the significance of silence. In moments like this, silence was not avoidance. It was protection. The palace had weathered centuries of challenges by knowing when not to speak. This was one of those moments. Not because the truth was dangerous, but because it required context, and context takes time. Messages moved quietly between trusted hands. Reports were reviewed again, not. Behind palace walls, preparations had been unfolding long before the public became aware. Conversations had been happening in low voices. Decisions weighed carefully. Every step taken with sensitivity rather than urgency. As the confirmation reached the public, one truth became impossible to deny. This was not just news. It was a moment of collective pause. And whatever lay ahead, it would be faced not with noise, but with dignity. The palace did not rush its words. Every sentence was chosen with intention, not to alarm, but to acknowledge. When the confirmation was finally shared, it carried a tone that felt unmistakably sincere, calm, respectful, heavy with meaning. Inside the palace, the mood had already shifted hours earlier. There was no chaos, no visible distress. Instead, there was quiet coordination, the kind that emerges when everyone understands the importance of restraint. This was not a moment for speculation or emotional reaction. It was a moment for steadiness. King Charles had long been known for his sense of duty, for his measured approach to responsibility. Those closest to him understood that this confirmation was not shared lightly. It reflected careful consideration, not impulse. Staff moved with quiet purpose. Schedules were adjusted subtly. Communications were monitored closely. Nothing appeared unusual to the outside observer, and that was deliberate. The palace had learned over centuries that calm is not the absence of concern. It is the presence of control. The confirmation did not attempt to explain everything. It did not promise certainty. Instead, it acknowledged reality while preserving dignity. That balance mattered. Those within the palace understood the emotional weight of the moment. This was not just about leadership or continuity. It was about a man who had spent a lifetime preparing for responsibility, now facing a moment that demanded quiet strength. There were no dramatic reactions, no visible displays of distress. But in the stillness, concern was unmistakable. King Charles himself remained composed, his demeanor steady. He understood better than anyone the impact of such confirmation, not just on the institution, but on people who had followed his journey for decades. Responsibility did not disappear in moments like this. If anything, it became more profound. Private conversations took place behind closed doors. Not urgent, not panicked, thoughtful. The focus was not on what might happen, but on what must be done now. Continuity, clarity, and care guided every discussion. The palace had chosen honesty over reassurance, and that honesty resonated. Outside, the response was immediate but subdued. There was no frenzy, no rush to conclusions. Instead, there was a collective stillness, a shared sense that this moment required respect rather than noise. Within the palace walls, preparations continued quietly. Not because something was ending, but because responsibility demanded readiness. Every scenario was considered carefully, without assumption. The confirmation did not weaken stability. It tested it. And stability, once tested, reveals its true strength. As the day progressed, it became clear that this was not a moment defined by fear. It was defined by realism, by acknowledgement, by the understanding that leadership is not about appearing invulnerable, it is about facing reality with composure. The palace remained calm because calm was necessary. And in that calm, one thing was clear. Whatever lay ahead would be handled with the same dignity that had defined every step so far. Behind the palace gates, the confirmation did not bring chaos, it brought clarity. Once the words were released to the public, the internal focus shifted immediately from communication to continuity. This was not about reaction. It was about management, structure, and calm execution. The king's condition, as acknowledged by the palace, required careful balance. Not secrecy, but discretion. Not denial, but dignity. Every movement within the royal household reflected that understanding. Meetings were held quietly, often with fewer people than usual. The intention was not exclusion, but precision. Those involved understood the importance of stability, not just for the institution, but for public confidence. Nothing undermines trust faster than visible uncertainty. King Charles remained actively engaged. Those close to him noted that his approach had not changed dramatically. If anything, it had become more focused. There was no sense of withdrawal, no visible sign of surrendering responsibility. Instead, there was adjustment, subtle, intentional, and controlled. Schedules were reviewed with care. Some engagements were modified. Others quietly postponed. The changes were not framed as limitations, but as thoughtful decisions aligned with long-term responsibility. This distinction mattered inside the palace. There was a shared understanding that this moment required unity rather than commentary. Conversations were direct but respectful. Emotional but contained. Everyone recognized that this was not just about one individual. It was about preserving rhythm and confidence. Prince William played a quiet but noticeable role. He did not step forward publicly, nor did he withdraw. His presence was steady, supportive, and deliberate. Those observing internally understood that continuity does not begin with announcements, it begins with preparation. There was no dramatic reshuffling, no visible shift in hierarchy. That absence was intentional. Stability, the palace believed, is often demonstrated by what does not change. The confirmation had also prompted a deeper internal review, not of leadership, but of resilience. How systems respond, how responsibilities overlap, how continuity is ensured without disruption. These were not new conversations, but they carried renewed importance. King Charles was fully aware of the symbolism surrounding every decision. Even the smallest gesture carried weight. He understood that strength in this moment would be measured not by visibility, but by consistency. Those closest to him described his demeanor as thoughtful rather than burdened, reflective rather than anxious. This was not a man retreating from duty, it was a man redefining how duty was expressed within the palace walls. There was respect for the emotional dimension of the moment, quiet acknowledgement that concern existed. That uncertainty was natural, but those feelings were not allowed to dominate decision-making. Responsibility remained the guiding force. Outside, speculation continued, as it always does. But inside, there was little attention paid to noise. The palace had learned long ago that speculation fades, but structure endures. The confirmation had also reinforced the importance of trust between the monarchy and the public. That trust, once established, must be maintained through honesty without excess. The palace believed it had struck that balance as days unfolded. The initial weight of the news settled into a steadier rhythm. Adjustments became routine. Calm became habitual again. The institution did what it had always done, adapted quietly. King Charles continued to be seen, continued to engage, continued to lead, not through grand gestures, but through presence. That presence mattered more than any statement ever could. This was not a moment of collapse. It was a moment of recalibration, and within that recalibration, the monarchy demonstrated something it rarely speaks about openly. Resilience, not as an abstract idea, but as a practiced discipline. The palace did not deny reality. It absorbed it, and in doing so, it reminded everyone watching that continuity is not about pretending nothing has changed. It is about ensuring that change does not undo what matters most. As the days passed, the initial announcement began to fade from headlines. But inside the palace, its presence remained constant. Not as fear, not as urgency, but as awareness. This was the kind of awareness that sharpened focus and deepened responsibility. King Charles understood the power of silence. Throughout his life, he had learned that not every moment demanded explanation. Some moments required endurance. And this was one of them. Those who encountered him during this time noted something subtle yet unmistakable. His demeanor had not weakened. If anything, it had grown more deliberate. Every interaction carried intention. Every decision reflected thought rather than haste. There were no visible signs of retreat from duty. Instead, there was adjustment, carefully calibrated and quietly executed. Responsibilities continued, though framed with greater attention to balance. The goal was not to prove strength, but to preserve it. Within the palace, conversations were respectful and honest. There was space for concern, but no room for speculation. Everyone involved understood the significance of maintaining composure. Emotional reactions, though natural, were kept private. Public confidence depended on quiet assurance. The king's inner circle operated with precision. Information was shared carefully. Boundaries were respected. The emphasis was not on controlling narrative, but on protecting dignity. This period also brought moments of reflection. King Charles, long accustomed to public scrutiny, now faced a quieter challenge, one that required personal resilience rather than public performance. Those close to him observed that he approached this phase with the same sense of responsibility that had defined his life. Prince William remained present, not in the spotlight, but in support. His role was not to replace, but to reinforce. Continuity, the palace believed, was best demonstrated through stability, not transition. Behind closed doors, planning continued, not because an ending was anticipated, but because preparedness is a form of respect. Every scenario was considered calmly, without assumption or alarm. This was not pessimism. It was prudence. The monarchy had weathered countless moments of uncertainty before. What set this moment apart was its quietness. There were no dramatic shifts, no visible cracks. The institution did not react, it responded. King Charles carried the weight of this period privately. He did not seek sympathy. He did not invite speculation. He simply continued. That continuation sent a powerful message. Strength is not always loud. Leadership is not always visible. Sometimes it is defined by consistency in the face of uncertainty. As public attention gradually shifted elsewhere, the palace maintained its steady rhythm. Engagements resumed thoughtfully. Presence remained consistent. Nothing felt forced. Nothing felt withdrawn. Inside, there was respect for the emotional reality of the situation. Quiet support existed. Conversations were sincere. But those emotions did not override responsibility. This balance between humanity and duty defined the period. King Charles did not deny the seriousness of the moment. He acknowledged it through action rather than words, through steadiness rather than display. The silence surrounding his condition was not avoidance. It was intention. A recognition that some matters are best handled without spectacle. And in that silence, the monarchy reaffirmed something fundamental. Its strength does not come from appearances, but from continuity practiced daily, even under strain. The weight was real, but it was carried. And as long as it was carried with dignity, stability remained intact. By the time the week drew to a close, the palace had returned to its familiar rhythm, not because the confirmation had been forgotten, but because it had been absorbed. This distinction mattered. Moments that challenge continuity do not always announce themselves loudly. Sometimes they are integrated quietly, becoming part of the institution's ongoing discipline. King Charles continued to lead with restraint. There were no dramatic gestures meant to reassure, no public attempts to reshape perception. Instead, there was consistency. A steady presence that spoke more convincingly than any declaration ever could. Those around him understood that this phase was not about denial. It was about adaptation. Adjustments had been made carefully, without disruption. Responsibilities were shared thoughtfully. Schedules reflected balance rather than limitation. The monarchy did not pause, it recalibrated. Public response, though initially emotional, evolved into quiet respect. The absence of spectacle allowed space for reflection rather than anxiety. People recognized sincerity when they saw it. Calm invited calm. Prince William's role remained supportive and deliberate. He did not step forward to overshadow. He did not retreat to create distance. His presence reinforced continuity without signaling change. That balance was intentional. Inside the palace, the focus remained on endurance rather than urgency. Every decision reflected a long view. The monarchy had never been sustained by short-term reactions. It had survived by thinking beyond the moment. King Charles himself remained composed, thoughtful, and present. He understood the symbolism of every appearance, every engagement, every pause. Leadership, he knew, was not measured by visibility alone. But by the assurance it provided, there were moments of quiet reflection, times when the weight of responsibility was felt privately. But those moments did not define the period. What defined it was composure. The palace did not frame this time as an ending or a turning point. It framed it as part of a continuum. History, after all, is not a series of isolated moments. It is a progression shaped by how moments are handled. By choosing restraint over reaction, the monarchy reinforced trust. By choosing dignity over drama, it preserved stability. By choosing continuity over speculation, it reaffirmed its purpose. The confirmation had not weakened the institution. It had tested its discipline. And discipline, practiced consistently, had prevailed. As attention slowly shifted away, the palace remained unchanged in function, even if understanding had deepened. Responsibility had not diminished. If anything, it had become more conscious. King Charles continued, not as a symbol of vulnerability, but as an example of measured strength. His approach reminded many that leadership is not about appearing unaffected. It is about remaining effective. The week ended not with resolution, but with reassurance, not through words, but through action. The monarchy stood steady, not because challenges were absent, but because they were managed. In the end, this period would not be remembered for fear or uncertainty. It would be remembered for calm, for dignity, for continuity maintained without spectacle. And that perhaps was the most powerful statement of all.